Jews were first mentioned in the city in the 16th century. However, there is little data about their presence, and the real history, the modern period history of the Jews in the city started in 1722, when they established a community below the castle, Subcitate or Váraja, which later on became the Orthodox center after splitting the Hungarian Jewry into Orthodox and Reform. This is a usual pattern that the poorer Jews are staying in a traditional place which has all the infrastructure, mikvaot, synagogues, Jewish schools, and the richer, more assimilated are living and settling among Christians. This happened also in Oradea. First, they inhabited the area around the fairground, where we have also the Orthodox synagogue, and then they continued to get closer to the Christian center and established themselves, this time not with the synagogue, but with the shopping mall, in today's terms, the Black Eagle. The great synagogue, which was the breakthrough temple, was the Zion temple, created in 1879, which sits on the riverside. Architect Busch, who was the city architect, had in the view, he remembered the view of the synagogue, the great Reform synagogue in Nuremberg, which also sat on the riverside, and there is a certain similarity between the two locations. Then Jews started to move to the new town across the Krish River, and there is a today pedestrian street where we have all these lavish Art Nouveau buildings, mainly the national type of Hungarian Art Nouveau, but in some buildings there is some French and Belgian influence, and from time to time also Austro-German influence, as is the case with the buildings of architect József and László Vágó. The synagogue fits neatly into the history of synagogues in the Hungarian kingdom. There were synagogue building waves following Jewish immigration. The first such a wave occurred by the end of the 18th century, and these were basically late Baroque synagogues. The next wave is in the Formats period, which is called in Hungarian Reformkor, meaning in the 1820s and 40s, exemplified by neoclassical synagogues. Hungary started to flourish after 1867, and it is going to be the third wave of synagogue building activities. This synagogue is in this wave being built in 1878, which is a period of the so-called Oriental or Moorish style, which was justified with the fact that Jews were the Orientals of Europe, which they were not, definitely not. Jews who inhabited these areas were Ashkenazic Jews who came to Europe during the Roman Empire, so it has little to do with the Orient proper. Nevertheless, the Gentile society needed to build, I would say, an invisible wall between Jews and non-Jews, and this wall, of course, applied to architectural style. The synagogue started to rise, became bigger and bigger, and therefore they needed an architectural element which differentiated them from the churches. This architectural element is the aforementioned Oriental style, which was somehow not the only architectural language element used in the building, but it was also the Neo-Renaissance. Renaissance was an important point of reference for the Jews because it was a beginning. It was the beginning of modern era. It was the beginning of creating a new Europe. And they felt entitled to take part in this movement, and this explains their predilection for a Renaissance style, Neo-Renaissance style, that they amply used in their secular architecture and partly also in synagogues. The synagogue was designed by architect David Busch, who was at the same time the chief architect of Oradea, which is quite a rare situation that a Jewish-born person becomes chief architect of the city, because Jews were not admitted to high-ranking municipal positions. In order to balance this fact, the entrepreneur who constructed the synagogue was a Gentile. And in a way, all along the history of building Oradea, this duality of Jews and Gentiles is the most important leading idea of the success of the Jews and, of course, non-Jews of the cities. The synagogue came into being 3 years after the split of Hungarian Jewish communities into Orthodox and Neolog, and represents the Neolog, i.e. the Reform movement, which abolished a lot of limitations, elements of the Orthodox synagogues, that women were separated from men with some grids called mehica, that the women's gallery was always a cramped, crowded area, and it were the men who took the leading role. So sort of women's emancipation occurred also among the Jewish members of the Jewish community. The synagogue has a large central square, and the women's gallery runs around in a U shape, and this square is topped by the dome. The dome has no functions in terms of liturgy, because the liturgy has changed. Jews are not sitting around the center of the building, around the bima, or the scripture, which represents the core of Jewish existence, but Jews are facing the Aron HaKodesh, which is a composition that encompasses the bima as well. So we see the ark, the Holy Ark, and in front of is the service. So this duality of the service, traditional synagogue service, between the ark, which represents the eternal Jewish existence, holy city of Jerusalem, and the here and now with the bima, is actually abolished, and the two came together. Meaning the Jews are not longing anymore to get back to Jerusalem, but the here and now is the real situation. And this real situation is this unbelievable optimism shared by Jews and, of course, by Gentiles in the period between 1870 and World War I. Unlike Christian churches that at that period used historic forms, historic structures, the synagogue is eager to show modernity. Therefore, the structure is partly metal. Metal, the material of the future in the mid-19th century, was an essential statement to reinforce Jewish commitment for modernity. Interestingly, these columns are partly Romanesque, the so-called Würfelkapitel, and partly capitals that are composite Ionic Corinthian capitals. So they are using the mainstream of Western architectural history, while many elements, particularly in the exterior, use Oriental style. There is a prejudice among Gentile population, that all the Jews were rich. But it wasn't the case. The majority of the Jews in Oradea were Orthodox and basically poor. This is a building which could be easily termed as a Judenhof, a place before the emancipation where Jews used to live. The building was erected by Isidor Ullman, a rich entrepreneur, an Orthodox Jew, who created this building for the poor people of the neighborhood. The building is located adjacent to the large Orthodox synagogue and on the fairgrounds, which was the place where these people worked. We are on the last floor of this unusual apartment block, which overlooks the Orthodox quarter with a fantastic look to the Orthodox synagogue. The house was commissioned by Isidor's son, Sándor, who hired architect Ferenc Löbl, probably a member of the Orthodox community, and stylistically the building represents an interesting melange. It is the period 1912-13 of proto-modernist architecture, with some elements of neo-Baroque. And these two aspects of architectural history, two stylistic periods, are mixed in a very elegant way. Basically, the details are the geometrical succession following Joseph Hoffmann, and the staircase is probably one of the highlights of the building, which has a semi-spiral staircase resembling the staircase in Otto Wagner's Majolika house in Vienna. Probably the most striking element of this building is on the facade. There are two central projections, and on each, on the last floor, we have Jewish symbols. The building's facade has an unusual iconography, not unusual only in the context of Oradea, but actually a wider region. Usually there are some Jewish symbols on houses inhabited by Jews with a strong identity, but these symbols are usually small. It could be a six-pointed star, it could be a little Judean lion. But in this house there are two massive projections, and on the last floor of these projections is a large menorah representing the statehood of Israel, surrounded by two Judean lions. All this is done in ceramics, which was around from Art Nouveau until modern architecture came into being in the region. Oradea, Nagyvárad Grosswardein, was often nicknamed as a little Budapest. And there were many parallels between the two cities. Most of all, the presence of Jewish population. Budapest, that was also nicknamed as Budapest, had 1/4 of Jewish population, and in Oradea the situation was similar. Two ambitious businessmen, Kurländer and Adorjan, embarked on this large project on the place of a former inn called Black Eagle. This is the way it got its name. And this inn in the 18th century was just at the beginning of the history of the Jewish quarter. Oradea is a city where you can find different branches of Hungarian Art Nouveau. You can find a more cosmopolitan one of the Vágó brothers, and you can find a more national, the architecture of Jakab Dezső and Komor Marcel, who created this building. The building itself is very modern. This is a passage, as the Ullman Palace has been in Budapest. So in very many ways, in terms of function, in terms of design, mass formation, the building is modern. Its intention was, in terms of urban context, to give a riposte to the churches, the Catholic, the Greco-Catholic, and the Greek Orthodox. This is the reason that this building has a tower. Otherwise, the tower won't be justified in such a building that comprised offices, hotel rooms, and a little theater hall, and among others, a lot of cafe. So it is, first of all, Art Nouveau, which is important for the Jews as a new type of expression, as a new art. And on the other hand, it is important because it is Hungarian. Why were they so eager to show some Hungarian identity? The idea goes back to mid-19th century, where Jews were not yet emancipated in the empire, and Jews negotiated with Lajos Kossuth, the leader of the Hungarian movement, and they made a gentleman's agreement. If the Jews are willing to speak Hungarian and have a Hungarian identity, they would get emancipation. They would get free movement, possibility of earning private property. Actually, they would become organic part of the Hungarian nation. So this was the motivation of many enlightened Jews, basically Reformed Jews, to show this enlightenment, this convergence of Jewish enlightenment, the Haskalah, and the modern times in the country. Dezső Jakab and Marcel Komor were pupils of Ödön Lechna. More importantly, Jakab was born in Réve, a village not far from Oradea. So he considered himself here as a native. They were architects who were really committed to the cause of this national type of architectural expression. Marcel Komor edited a very important journal, the Entrepreneur's Weekly, in which he propagated the Hungarian style on a weekly basis. I read some 1,000 articles of him where he advocated the use of this style. And as mentioned earlier, this style was at the same time hallmarking Hungarian presence in the fringes of the kingdom, i.e. in Partium, in Transylvania, in what is today Vojvodina, in what is today Muraköz, Prekomurie, actually today Slovenia, also partly in Slovakia, which was then called Upper Hungary, and a small section also in the Ukraine around Ugmar, which was Hungarian territory. Interestingly, when this territory ceased to be Hungarian, these buildings ceased to radiate this Hungarian spirit, and they became a couleur locale. They became part of the local identity, and in many cases, Dezső Jakab and Marcel Komor is part of the local identity of cities like Tirgumurec, like Oradea, or Subotica in Serbia. Regarding nationalism, it should be mentioned that this Jewish Hungarian, of course in quotation marks, Art Nouveau, wasn't accepted entirely in the Hungarian kingdom. There were very hostile forces to this movement. The nephew of Ödön Lechner, Kismarty Jenő, attacked the Hungarian Jewish-born architects to pursue a style that is not genuinely Hungarian, that is a pastiche of Hungarian folklore, which is imbued with Jewish spirit. And it was 1906 when this scandal unfolded, just the years when this building was constructed. The objection was that these Jewish architects strangled the Hungarian folklore elements from their context and created a free composition out of it. So in very many ways, they proceeded like musicians. If you take Johannes Brahms and his Hungarian dances, Brahms have been to Hungary and heard these dances, but these dances are still German. So these Hungarian architects who were against this style were right that this style wasn't really properly Hungarian. On the other hand, you raise the question, what is properly Hungarian? And you come to the conclusion of the impossibility of a genuine national architectural language. Architecture is always a compromise between physical data, between structure, between function, and some ideological contents.